sure think of everything, including our Winstons.
Brownie movie cameras are so easy to operate and so inexpensive.
Do you remember those everyday 70s things? The ones so normal back then, they'd leave people stunned today? In the 1970s, these habits, gadgets, and styles shaped how we worked, played, and even saw ourselves. When did ordinary life start feeling so unrecognizable? Smoking sections in restaurants were as common as menus in the 1970s. The moment you walked in, the host or hostess would ask, "Smoking or non?" And whichever you chose, the air smelled faintly of tobacco anyway. Cigarette machines stood by the entrance, glowing with brand names, ready to sell a pack to anyone with change. Ashtrays sat on every table, heavy glass or metal ones that clinked when you moved them. Waitresses carried trays of coffee and plates of food through a haze that hung over the dining room. Menus sometimes even had cigarette brands advertised on the back. The clatter of plates mixed with the flick of lighters was just part of the atmosphere. You could see the curl of smoke rise and drift across the room, blending with the smell of fried food. Servers often had to brush ash from the table before setting down dessert. Even non-smoking sections were only a few feet from the smokers, with no real separation. Families thought nothing of eating pancakes while someone at the next table lit a cigarette. Even fast food places sometimes had smoking sections cordoned off by nothing more than a sign. For better or worse, the smell of cigarette smoke and fried food became part of the restaurant experience. Today, it is hard to imagine kids coloring in paper placemats while smoke curled in the air above them, but in the 1970s, it was simply normal. Ashtrays in airplanes and buses were a standard feature, built right into the armrests. Even if you were not a smoker, they were there, waiting to be flipped open with a little metal click. On airplanes, the "no smoking" sign was just something that lit up during takeoff and landing. Once you were in the air, lighting up was allowed in the designated rows. The air was filtered, but you could still smell the smoke drifting back through the cabin. Bus windows opened just enough to let out a wisp of cigarette smoke while the ashtrays filled up with gray powder. Some passengers carried their own lighters and packs, making smoking mid-trip a kind of ritual. The smell would cling to the seats and curtains long after the trip was over. In buses, the ashtrays often rattled in their slots when the vehicle hit a bump. Flight attendants and bus drivers moved through the haze as if it were invisible. No one thought to complain. It was simply the way travel worked. Some ashtrays had burn marks from cigarettes that had been stubbed out too hard. It was all so routine that no one thought about the idea of traveling without them. Passengers chatted, read newspapers, and smoked as if the miles rolled by on a moving lounge. Now, seeing an ashtray in a seat would be like spotting an artifact from another time. No helmets. While riding bikes or skateboards was just how it was. You climbed onto your bike, maybe with a banana seat and long chrome handlebars, and rode off down the street without a thought to head protection. Skateboards were slim, hard plastic boards with narrow wheels, and kids zipped down driveways or makeshift ramps bareheaded. Falls were part of the deal. You got scraped elbows, bruised knees, and maybe a goose egg on your head, and then you got back on. Parents told you to be careful, and that was the extent of the safety lecture. Neighborhood races often meant weaving between parked cars at full speed. If you wiped out, friends helped you up, brushed off the gravel, and sent you on your way. Summer afternoons were filled with daring stunts off homemade plywood ramps. Sometimes you rode barefoot, just because it felt faster and freer. Protective gear was something you only saw in magazines, not in real life. Some kids rode 2 or 3 on a single bike, one on the handlebars, another balanced on the back wheel pegs. Nobody owned knee or elbow pads unless they played organized sports. The idea of wearing a helmet for casual riding just did not exist. Today, it is shocking to think of the risks, but in the 1970s, it was simply freedom on wheels. Only 3 or 4 TV channels meant your entertainment choices were slim but somehow enough. Most homes had ABC, CBS, NBC, and maybe a local independent station if you were lucky. Saturday mornings were for cartoons, evenings for family sitcoms, and if you missed a show, you had to wait for a rerun months later. There was no scrolling through endless menus, just turning the knob until something appeared on the screen. Snowy reception meant adjusting the rabbit ear antennas until the picture came in clear. Sometimes someone had to stand just right, holding the antenna, for the picture to stay steady. Late-night TV often signed off with the national anthem before going to static until morning. Big events, like the moon landing or a major sports game, were moments when the whole country tuned in together. Kids learned which nights their favorite shows aired and made sure homework was done in time. There was a sense of ceremony in gathering in the living room for a show the whole family wanted to see. Commercial breaks were long enough for a snack run to the kitchen without pausing anything. When a big event aired, everyone you knew watched it at the same time. It gave television a shared rhythm that no one questioned. Now, with hundreds of channels and streaming on demand, it is almost hard to believe how simple television once was. Rotary dial. Telephones in every home were more than just communication. They were part of the furniture. The heavy handset rested on a solid base, and the dial clicked as you turned it for each number. You had to know phone numbers by memory or keep a handwritten list by the phone. If you messed up a digit, you started over from the beginning. Calls had a certain patience to them. You could not rush through the dial. The circular motion of the dial was oddly satisfying, each return spin making a soft whirring sound. The phone cord always seemed to twist into knots no matter how careful you were. Some families had a second phone in the hallway or bedroom, but they all shared the same line. Teenagers often hogged the phone, stretching the cord as far as possible to have semi-private conversations. The sound of that solid mechanical bell ring could make the whole house pause. Phones were often mounted on the kitchen wall with a cord that stretched just far enough to reach the table. Private conversations meant dragging the cord into the hallway and hoping no one listened in. The ring was loud enough to be heard through the whole house. Today's silent, pocket-sized devices make it almost surreal to think about being tethered to one spot just to make a call. Gas station attendants. Filling your tank was the standard experience in many places. You would pull up, roll down your window, and the attendant would come over in a uniform shirt and cap. They pumped your gas, washed your windshield, and sometimes checked your oil, all while you stayed in the car. Kids in the back seat would watch the numbers spin on the pump like it was a slot machine. Attendants often knew regular customers by name and asked about the family. Sometimes they topped off your washer fluid without you even asking. They carried rags in their back pockets and wore hands stained from years of oil and grease. The squeegee work on the windshield was quick but precise, wiping away bug splatters and dust. On cold days, they worked in freezing wind, their breath visible as they leaned in to talk through your window. Some stations even offered a quick tire check, making sure you left safer than when you arrived. Payment was handled right there at your window, cash or card run through a clunky manual machine. There was a rhythm to it. Fill, clean, check, thank you, that made every stop feel like a small service ritual. It was a level of personal interaction that is rare at gas stations today. The idea of getting out to pump your own gas would have seemed unusual in many towns back then. Film cameras you had to take to be developed required planning and patience. You loaded the roll carefully, advanced the film after each shot, and hoped you had set the light and focus correctly. When the roll was done, you dropped it off at a drugstore or camera shop and waited days, sometimes a week, to see the pictures. Every shot mattered because film was not cheap, and rolls had a limited number of exposures. You did not know if someone blinked or if the picture was blurry until you held the prints in your hand. Some people wrote the date or occasion on the white border of each photo. You might get duplicates to share with friends or family. If the photos were bad, you laughed about it and kept them anyway. Vacations were documented with carefully staged group shots, knowing you would not get a second chance. Picking up your prints was often paired with flipping through them right in the store parking lot. Some people used photo albums as the official record of family history. Opening that envelope from the photo lab was like unwrapping a small gift. Half the fun was the surprise of what you had captured. Instant feedback from digital cameras would have seemed like science fiction to anyone used to waiting for their memories to develop. Party lines for home phones were a mix of convenience and curiosity. Instead of having a private phone line, you shared it with neighbors. When you picked up the receiver, you might hear someone else already talking. You had to wait your turn or politely ask to use the line. It was easy to overhear bits of conversation, and some people listened longer than they should have. Sometimes you would pick up the phone quietly just to hear the gossip. Kids learned which ring pattern belonged to their house and ran to answer. Politeness varied. Some neighbors kept calls short, others seemed to settle in for hours. If there was an emergency, people would usually hang up immediately to give you the line. The shared connection often led to friendships or feuds, depending on who was on the other end. Rings were coded, 2 short rings for one household, 1 long ring for another. Sometimes you learned more about your neighbors than you ever intended to. Privacy was a luxury, but the shared connection felt oddly communal. Today, with everyone carrying a private phone, the idea of sharing a line with strangers would be unthinkable. TVs without remote controls meant you had to get up to change the channel or adjust the volume. Sets were bulky, heavy pieces of furniture with knobs that clicked as you turned them. Kids were often the unofficial remote controls, sent to switch stations during commercial breaks. If you wanted better reception, you twisted the antennas until the picture cleared. Fine-tuning was an actual dial you turned to make the image sharper. Sometimes aluminum foil was wrapped around the antenna tips for better reception. Channel surfing was a workout. You could only flip one station at a time by hand. Parents often claimed the good chair closest to the TV so they could change channels without getting up. If you lost your place during fine-tuning, you had to start over, slowly dialing until the picture stopped rolling. Watching TV together meant agreeing on one program and sticking with it for the night. Changing the channel too quickly could make the picture roll or the sound crackle. Some families had TVs with dials that wore smooth from constant use. It was physical interaction with your entertainment that is almost gone today. The convenience of a remote would have seemed like a luxury, but in the 1970s, no one missed what they had never known. Stores closing on Sundays was simply part of life in the 1970s. Sunday was considered a day of rest, and that meant most shops locked their doors. If you forgot to buy something on Saturday, you had to wait until Monday. Families planned their errands carefully to avoid being caught short. The quiet streets on Sundays felt almost eerie compared to the bustle of the week. Restaurants often adjusted their menus for the smaller Sunday crowds, and downtowns looked like ghost towns. Church bells were sometimes the loudest sound you would hear in the middle of the day. Kids played in the street without worrying about traffic from shoppers. It was a time for big family meals, long walks, and visits with neighbors. The pace of life slowed so much that even the air seemed calmer. Gas stations, hardware stores, and even grocery stores often joined in, leaving only a few essential services open. Some people loved it because it forced everyone to slow down. Others found it frustrating when they suddenly needed something. But it was a rhythm everyone accepted, and the stillness of a Sunday afternoon was part of the era's character. Today's 24-hour shopping world makes the idea of a completely closed Sunday almost unbelievable. Milk delivered to your door was still a familiar sight in the early 1970s. The milkman came in the morning, leaving glass bottles in an insulated box by your doorstep. The clinking of bottles was the sound that told you breakfast could begin. Sometimes cream would settle on top, a treat to be spooned out first. Neighbors waved to the delivery truck as it moved from house to house. In winter, the tops of the bottles could freeze and push the cardboard caps up like little towers. Some milkmen also brought eggs, butter, or bread along with the milk. Families often had a standing order, so the same amount appeared like clockwork each week. The delivery route became a small social network, with the milkman sharing bits of neighborhood news. Children sometimes left thank you notes or drawings tucked into the empty bottles. Empty bottles were rinsed and left out for collection, ready to be refilled. It felt personal, like part of a relationship between the milkman and the family. This service slowly faded as supermarkets took over, but back then, it was a simple convenience everyone appreciated. Payphones on every street corner were the lifeline of communication away from home. You always carried a few coins in case you needed to make a call. The metal booth offered a strange mix of privacy and exposure, with glass walls and a door that never quite shut. The smell of metal, paper, and sometimes cigarette smoke was part of the experience. You might find a forgotten coin in the change slot if you were lucky. Rainy days fogged up the glass, making the booth feel like a tiny, steamy hideout. Sometimes you had to wait in line, especially near busy intersections or popular hangouts. If the phone was broken, you would hunt for another booth nearby. Long-distance calls felt special, with the clink of coins dropping into the slot as the minutes ticked by. Graffiti and carved initials often told stories of people who had stood there before you. Long-distance calls required more change fed into the slot as the operator's voice prompted you. Phone books hung from chains, pages worn thin from use. Now the sight of a payphone is rare, a reminder of when calling someone meant finding the nearest booth. Polaroid instant cameras as a party trick were pure magic. You snapped a picture, pulled out the developing film, and waited as the image slowly appeared. Friends gathered around, shaking the photo even though it was not necessary. The smell of the developing chemicals was sharp but oddly memorable. Every shot felt special because film was expensive. The whir of the camera's rollers was almost as exciting as seeing the image appear. People often took funny face photos, knowing they would have a keepsake to laugh at minutes later. If a picture came out too dark or light, it became part of the party's running jokes. Some photos ended up tacked to the fridge before the night was over. Others were slipped into wallets or given to friends as instant mementos. People posed differently, knowing they would see the result right away. Passing around the finished picture was as much fun as taking it. Polaroids turned gatherings into shared events, giving you a souvenir before the night was even over. Encyclopedias on the shelf. Instead of Google, were a mark of pride in many homes. A full set, often bought from a door-to-door salesman, lined the living room shelves. The leather-bound volumes were heavy and smelled faintly of paper and glue. Students spent hours flipping through them for school projects. Color plates and maps made learning feel hands-on. Some families kept yearly updates to make sure their set stayed current. Pages were often marked with bookmarks or scraps of paper for ongoing research projects. You might get distracted and read about topics you had not planned to, just because the page caught your eye. The books sometimes doubled as step stools or paperweights in a pinch. They were expensive, and owning a set signaled a certain seriousness about education. Once printed, they were frozen in time, so facts could slowly become outdated. But they were trusted, and using them felt serious and scholarly. Today, with answers a few keystrokes away, it is almost hard to imagine paging through book after book to find a single detail. Paper road maps in the glove compartment were essential for any trip. You unfolded them into a giant rectangle, tracing routes with your finger. Folding them back neatly was a challenge few could master. The paper grew soft and creased from repeated use. Parents would sometimes argue over which turn to take while a map lay open across the dashboard. Kids in the back seat would trace the bold red and blue lines, imagining adventures to places they had never been. Some maps had advertisements for roadside diners or motels printed on the back, adding to the sense of possibility. A well-used map could survive for years, patched with tape and marked with highlighter. It was as much a travel companion as it was a tool. You learned to read the symbols for highways, rest stops, and scenic routes. If you got lost, you pulled over and consulted the map under the dim light of the car's dome. Maps were both a tool and a record of where you had been, with coffee stains or scribbled notes marking the pages. GPS would have seemed like a miracle, but part of the adventure was finding your own way. Banking without ATMs meant every transaction had to happen in person during banking hours. If you needed cash, you stood in line at the teller's window. Deposit slips and withdrawal forms were filled out by hand. The sound of paper stamps echoed through the marble halls of the bank. Payday Fridays meant long lines that wrapped around the lobby. You could smell the faint scent of paper, ink, and coin bags as you waited. Tellers often greeted you by name and remembered details about your last visit. Children might be given a lollipop or a sticker while their parents handled business. You learned to budget carefully because getting more cash required another trip to the bank. There was a sense of formality. Transactions were conducted face-to-face, and the pen was always chained to the counter. You kept a careful record in your checkbook because there was no instant account balance to check. It was slower, but it felt more personal, with tellers who often knew your name. The convenience of 24-hour ATMs would have been unimaginable in a world where your money was only accessible during certain hours. Cashiers. Using mechanical cash registers gave every purchase a soundtrack. Each key clacked loudly, and pulling the lever rang up the total with a satisfying ding. Prices were entered manually, so accuracy depended on the cashier's skill. The receipt was a thin strip of paper, faintly smelling of ink. Change was counted back into your hand, coins clinking one by one. Some cashiers had a speed and rhythm that made the whole process almost musical. Customers often chatted during checkout, the clatter of keys filling the pauses. The cash drawer's heavy spring action could surprise you if you were not ready. Every transaction felt tangible, with the money visible and handled right in front of you. There was a sense of trust built in the way totals were calculated in plain sight. The cash drawer slammed shut with a weighty finality. There was a rhythm to it, a small performance at the end of every transaction. Modern barcode scanners are faster, but they lack the tangible charm of those old machines. Typewriters as everyday office equipment filled workplaces with the steady chatter of keys. Each letter struck the page with a satisfying thump. Mistakes meant reaching for correction fluid or special eraser tape. Carriage returns required a firm push on the lever. Typing speed was a valued skill, and accuracy was everything. Secretaries and typists wore the faint gray smudges of carbon paper on their fingertips. Some people personalized their typewriters with stickers or colored key covers. The sound of a busy office was a mix of clicking keys, carriage bells, and pages being stacked. Replacing a ribbon was messy but satisfying, like giving the machine new life. Every finished page was the result of deliberate effort, not just a tap of a backspace key. Carbon paper made copies, leaving hands smudged with black ink. The smell of fresh ribbon ink was part of the office atmosphere. Computers replaced typewriters in a rush, but in the 1970s, they were the heartbeat of written communication. Outdoor clotheslines for drying laundry were as common as washing machines. Freshly washed clothes were carried outside in a basket and pinned to the line with wooden clothespins. The smell of sun-dried sheets was unmatched by any fabric softener. Wind turned shirts and dresses into dancing silhouettes. You learned to check the weather before doing laundry, because rain could undo a day's work. Sheets flapped like sails, and towels dried stiff in the breeze, perfect for exfoliating after a shower. The wooden pins sometimes left faint marks on the fabric, a signature of line drying. On sunny days, the yard looked brighter with colorful clothes strung between poles. Laundry days became small neighborhood events, with neighbors greeting each other over the fence. Children sometimes darted between the hanging clothes, turning the lines into an obstacle course. Clotheslines stretched across backyards or between apartment buildings. Neighbors might chat over the fence while hanging out their wash. Electric dryers existed, but nothing beat the simple satisfaction of clothes swaying in the breeze. Cold metal lunchboxes with matching thermoses were more than just containers for your food. They were badges of identity. In the 1970s, a lunchbox was often emblazoned with your favorite TV show, cartoon, or movie. You carried it proudly to school, the painted metal clanging softly with every step. Inside was the matching thermos, usually holding milk or soup, with a little plastic cup that doubled as the lid. The smell inside was a unique blend of whatever sandwich you had and the faint tang of warm milk from the thermos. Sometimes condensation from the thermos left the bread a little damp, but it was still eaten happily. On cold days, twisting the cap on a thermos full of soup sent up a comforting steam. Friends would compare designs at the lunch table, bragging about who had the newest characters. If you were lucky, your lunchbox had a latch that still clicked shut tightly after years of use. The clatter of opening several lunchboxes at once was its own lunchtime soundtrack. By lunchtime, the sandwich might be a little squished, the apple bruised, but it still tasted great because it was yours. Some kids traded parts of their lunch, pulling treasures out of their boxes like bargaining chips. If you dropped your lunchbox, it would dent, and every dent told a story, like the time you ran to catch the bus or it got knocked off the lunch table. Over time, the paint would chip at the corners, revealing the silver metal underneath, but you kept using it because replacing it meant losing a part of your school day identity. Opening that lunchbox each day was like unwrapping a small gift from home, and the clink of the thermos cap was part of the ritual. Today's insulated soft lunch bags feel practical, but they lack that solid, story-filled presence of a metal lunchbox. Ice trays. You had to twist to get cubes out were a daily little test of strength and coordination. They were made of rigid metal or hard plastic, filled with water, and slid into the freezer to harden. When you needed ice, you pulled out the tray, gripped both ends, and twisted sharply until the cubes cracked free. Sometimes the cubes popped out easily, skittering across the counter if you were not careful. Other times, they stuck stubbornly, forcing you to run warm water over the bottom of the tray to loosen them. Filling the trays was a careful balancing act, trying not to spill water on the way back to the freezer. Kids often volunteered to help, just to sneak a cube to suck on during summer. Metal trays made a sharper cracking sound while plastic ones gave a duller snap. Every so often, a cube would split, leaving jagged little shards in the bin. They were simple tools, but they made every cold drink feel like an accomplishment. The sound of ice cracking free was sharp and satisfying. Metal trays were colder to the touch, and if your fingers lingered, they would stick for a second, making you flinch. Even if you only needed a couple of cubes, you often ended up with the whole tray emptied into a bowl or bin for later use. Plastic ice cube makers and automatic ice dispensers have erased that small ritual, but in the 1970s, twisting a tray was part of getting a drink ready. Drinking directly from the garden hose was the purest kind of summer refreshment. On hot afternoons, you turned on the spigot, let the first burst of hot water run out, and then took a long, cold drink straight from the source. The water tasted faintly metallic, with a hint of rubber from the hose, but it was always welcome. Friends took turns passing the hose around, wiping their mouths with the back of a hand before handing it off. Sometimes you sprayed each other instead, turning a drink break into a water fight. The shock of icy water after the warm initial rush was part of the thrill. Some kids bent the hose to stop the flow and then let it go suddenly to surprise the next person drinking. On the hottest days, the hose became a makeshift sprinkler for running barefoot through the grass. The faint green smell of water mixed with lawn clippings made it feel even more like summer. Everyone knew exactly where the hose kinks were and how to untangle them in seconds. The cool splash on your face was as much a part of the ritual as the drink itself. Nobody worried about germs. Hydration and fun were the only concerns. The garden hose was your drinking fountain, your water gun, and sometimes your sprinkler system for an impromptu run through the yard. In an age before bottled water was a thing, the hose was as dependable as the sun on a summer day. Using phone books to find any number was an exercise in patience and alphabetical order. Every home had at least one thick directory, often more if you counted the yellow pages for businesses. If you needed to call someone, you flipped through the white pages until you found their last name, then their first, then the number. The thin pages rustled as you turned them carefully to avoid tearing. If you were looking for a business, you checked the yellow pages, flipping to bold section headings like plumbing or bakeries. Sometimes you found little stars or underlines marking the numbers of friends or relatives. The yellow pages were also full of colorful ads, some with coupons you could clip. In smaller towns, you could recognize the names of half the people listed. Kids sometimes flipped to random pages and prank-called strangers, much to their parents' disapproval. Old phone books were often stacked in closets or garages, waiting for recycling day. Sometimes you found more than you bargained for, like ads with catchy slogans or little maps. The books had a faint, inky smell that lingered on your fingertips. They were also handy for boosting a kid's height at the dinner table or propping open a door. Finding a number took longer, but it felt rewarding, like you had unearthed the exact piece of information you needed. Now, the idea of looking something up without typing it into a search bar feels like a relic from another world. Manual car windows and door locks were just the way cars worked. If you wanted to roll down the window, you grabbed the handle and cranked it in a steady circle. To lock the door, You pushed down the little knob by the window, and to unlock it, you pulled it up. If you were a kid, rolling the window down was a mini workout for your arm. Drivers had to lean across the seat to roll down the passenger side or lock all the doors. In winter, frozen locks meant you had to breathe warm air onto your hands before trying again. Sometimes the crank squeaked, adding its own soundtrack to the ride. If you forgot to lock the doors, you leaned over each seat one by one before getting out. Rolling the windows down on a hot day filled the car with wind that whipped your hair into knots. On long drives, kids would crank their window up and down just to pass the time. In the back seat, siblings sometimes fought over whose turn it was to control the window crank. There was no one-touch button or automatic safety stop. If your fingers got caught, you learned quickly to move them. Locks made a satisfying click when engaged, a small but certain sign you were secure. It was slower and more physical, but it connected you more directly to the machine you were in. Today's push-button convenience makes sense, but it also erases those small, tactile moments that defined travel in the 1970s. At some point, someone decided mirrors did not belong on just the walls of dance studios. They belonged in your living room too. Mirrored walls were supposed to open up small spaces and reflect natural light. What they actually did was double your clutter, amplify fingerprints, and make your guests deeply uncomfortable. People would walk past their own reflections during dinner, trying not to make eye contact with themselves. The idea was chic. The reality was cold, clinical, and impossible to keep clean. What was meant to make your room look bigger ended up making it look busier, messier, and 10 times more high maintenance. And once one mirror cracked or peeled, the illusion of glamour shattered instantly. Every smudge, every streak, every greasy fingerprint stood out like graffiti. If you tried to hang art on them, you ended up with a framing nightmare. And if one cracked, it did not just ruin the wall, it shattered the illusion entirely. Mirrored walls were the visual equivalent of trying too hard, and as it turns out, they were not even the most fragile design feature of the decade. That title belonged to something hiding right above your head. Before open concept became the norm, the kitchen pass-through window was the perfect compromise. It was a small rectangular opening in the wall, usually with a sliding panel or shutters, that connected the kitchen to the dining room. You could serve dishes straight through, peek out to check on guests, or whisper a message without leaving your post at the stove. It was functional and a little bit fun, like a drive-through for your own home. Kids loved it because it felt like a secret door. Adults loved it because it saved steps. These pass-throughs became iconic in mid-century ranch homes and suburban houses. But as walls came down and kitchens turned into wide-open living spaces, the humble pass-through lost its purpose. Some were plastered over during remodels. Others became awkward holes in drywall with no clear use. But once, they made kitchens feel like command centers, like you could be in 2 rooms at once. What did we gain when we knocked down those walls? And what subtle joys did we lose? The hand-crank food mill was a quiet champion in kitchens before electric blenders buzzed their way into dominance. With its simple design, a bowl, a blade, a hand crank, and a strainer, it turned soft vegetables and fruits into smooth purees with nothing but elbow grease. It did not need a plug. It just needed patience. You would place tomatoes, apples, or potatoes inside, then turn the handle slowly. Seeds, skins, and lumps were separated out, leaving a velvety mash that tasted more honest than anything a blade spinning at 10,000 rotations per minute could produce. It was ideal for baby food, applesauce, mashed potatoes, and tomato paste. And when you used it, you were not just cooking, you were tending. You were shaping food into its gentlest form. You felt connected to the process. And maybe, just maybe, the food tasted better because you worked for it. As technology took over, the hand-crank mill faded into storage, its quiet rhythm replaced by roaring motors and flashing lights. But in some kitchens, it still lives, reliable, low-tech, and full of dignity. It is not fast, it is not sleek, but it reminds us that sometimes food is better when made slowly, one turn at a time. Hitchhiking was once seen as adventurous, not reckless. People stuck out their thumbs with a smile and a sign, hoping for a ride and maybe a story. soldiers on leave, college students on break, wanderers with a dream. They all relied on the kindness of strangers. Roads were filled with possibilities, and nobody thought twice about pulling over. You might remember watching someone hop into a stranger's car and wave goodbye, trusting the road and the driver. It was how many got from one town to the next, especially before cheap bus fares and ride-sharing apps. Parents might warn you to be careful, but that was the extent of the worry. Hitchhiking was not illegal in most places. It was resourceful. Over time, though, stories of assaults, disappearances, and crimes changed the narrative. Laws tightened. Signs went up, "No hitchhiking." Now, in many states, it is restricted or outright banned. The open road closed itself off. Hitchhiking became a symbol of risk rather than freedom. But for those who once stuck out their thumb and caught a ride with a stranger, it still lives in memory as a gesture of trust. And just as strangers were trusted, so were quiet children waiting patiently in cars, alone. Orange and brown. Together, they were supposed to represent warmth, nature, and the grounded spirit of the 1970s. Designers called them earth tones. Homeowners called them modern. But within a few years, most people started calling them ugly. These colors crept into every corner of the house, from rust-colored curtains and burnt orange sofas to chocolate-brown carpets and gold-tinted kitchenware. When paired with low lighting and wood paneling, the effect was not soothing, it was stifling. Rooms felt smaller, homes felt older. The optimism of the post-war era was gone, and in its place came heavy, saturated tones that weighed everything down. It was like living inside a forever sunset that never let up. Even kids' bedrooms, meant to be bright and fun, often ended up looking like burnt orange caves. By the time the 1980s rolled around, decorators ran screaming toward pastels, neon, and glass. Orange and brown were buried under coats of white paint and forgotten, like the dusty shag carpets they often matched. But style was not the only thing people gave up on. Sometimes, even the furniture itself just gave out. Tile countertops used to be the envy of every stylish post-war kitchen. Bright turquoise, sunny yellow, or soft pink ceramic tiles lined the counters like a checkerboard of domestic optimism. But the secret every home cook knew was this: those grout lines were a menace. They absorbed spills, caught crumbs, and stained faster than you could scrub. You might as well have been cooking on a tiled floor. Still, people loved the look. It felt cheerful, polished, and clean, at least at first glance. The tiles were cool to the touch and easy to replace if one chipped. You wiped them down after every meal, but somehow they still told the story of every spill and every stir. Those stains were not just grime, they were memories set in stone. But no matter how often you scrubbed with baking soda and vinegar, the grout lines always seemed a shade darker than the day before. Eventually, the shine wore off. Laminate, granite, and seamless solid surfaces took over. You could wipe once and be done. No more grout brushes, no more bleach, but something about those tile counters still lingers in the memory. They were imperfect, yes, but also warm and lived in. Kitchens where birthday cakes were frosted and Sunday gravy simmered for hours. When did spotless surfaces become more important than stories? The cookie press was a piece of holiday magic that turned dough into art with nothing but a squeeze. With its interchangeable metal discs and ratchet-style handle, it could create dozens of perfect cookies in seconds, each one shaped like a flower, star, or tree. It was especially popular during the holiday season, when kitchens smelled of cinnamon and vanilla, and the radio played old Christmas tunes. The press made baking feel like a celebration. Kids would fight over who got to press the dough, and every batch felt like a tiny miracle. No rolling pin, no cookie cutter. Just one graceful push, and a perfect cookie appeared. The dough was usually soft and buttery, flavored with almond or lemon, and finished with a dusting of sugar or colored sprinkles. The cookie press was about more than efficiency. It was about beauty. It said your cookies could be delicious and delightful, but as store-bought cookies became more common, and as baking turned into a rare weekend chore instead of a family tradition, the press went quiet. It sits in the backs of drawers now, its discs scattered and forgotten. But for those who remember, it was a joy machine. When did we stop making food that felt like play? Sunbathing with baby oil and reflectors was the ultimate summer ritual. You lay out in the backyard, on the roof, or at the beach, armed with nothing but a bottle of Johnson's baby oil and a silver reflector under your chin. The goal? Tan fast, tan deep, and tan dark. The shine from the oil made your skin sizzle, and the reflector bounced rays straight into your face like a heat lamp. Everyone did it. Magazines encouraged it. Tan lines were a badge of honor, peeling skin a minor inconvenience. Sunscreen, if it was used at all, was barely SPF 4. People believed a good tan was healthy. Doctors warned of sunburn, but nobody listened. Today, dermatologists beg patients to stop tanning, and laws limit tanning bed access for minors. The link between ultraviolet exposure and skin cancer is undeniable. But back then, summer meant bronze skin and beach bodies, no matter the cost. Sunburns turned into tans, blisters were shrugged off, and if the oil left you red and raw, you did it again the next day. The danger came slowly. Just like another invisible risk, many families kept right next to the medicine cabinet, in a tiny glass stick filled with mercury. Plastic laminate countertops were everywhere in the 1970s, bright, glossy, and available in an endless parade of colors and faux textures. From butcher block prints to swirling marbles, these surfaces were supposed to look fancy without the fancy price tag. And for a short while, they did. But the plastic finish scratched easily, melted under hot pans, and chipped if you dropped anything heavier than a spoon. The edges would start to curl, the seams would swell, and if water got underneath, the entire counter could buckle. Once the damage started, there was no easy fix. Families either lived with the bubbling mess or had to replace the entire slab. Still, for a generation strapped for cash but hungry for style, laminate was the default. It felt modern until it very suddenly did not. And when people stepped outside to escape the chaos of the kitchen, they were often met with a patio that was just as frustrating. The electric hot plate built into the countertop was not meant to replace the stove. It was there for the in-between moments, the simmering, the reheating, the lonely cup of soup on a gray afternoon. It looked like a single stovetop coil embedded right into the counter, usually near the sink or beside the coffee station. You turned the knob and it glowed red. No pots stacked on burners, no full stove required. For single servings or quick boils, it was perfect. They became especially popular in the 1950s and 1960s during the height of the modern kitchen boom. They were sleek, functional, and felt futuristic. But they came with risks. Open coils got hot fast, stayed hot longer, and were sometimes forgotten. Over time, homeowners chose to have more counter space instead. The coils vanished, replaced with cutting boards and clean surfaces. But those hot plates once stood for independence, the idea that a small meal still mattered, that a house could be big, but one burner could still feel like home. What part of the kitchen did we lose when we made everything smooth? The O'Keefe and Merit Aristocrat range was not just a stove, it was a throne. Towering over every other appliance in the room, this 734-pound marvel was the ultimate status symbol in post-war kitchens. It did not whisper innovation, it shouted it. With twin ovens, broilers, warming drawers, and a built-in timer clock, it looked like something from a science fiction movie, only real. Housewives of the 1940s and 1950s dreamed of owning one. Advertisements called it the Cadillac of kitchen ranges, and they were not exaggerating. You could roast a turkey, bake a pie, broil steaks, and warm dinner rolls at the same time. It was massive, yes, but that size came with function. Wide enamel cooktops offered space for every pot and pan. The dials were thick, confident, and satisfying to turn. It felt like driving a classic car, slow, powerful, and designed to last forever. But time moves fast, kitchens shrank, stainless steel arrived, and the Aristocrat, once a dream, became too heavy, too large, too old-fashioned. Most were discarded during remodels, sold for scrap or left in garages like relics from a forgotten empire. But ask anyone who grew up with one, and they will tell you that stove made cooking feel like a ceremony. When did we decide that smaller meant better? Mercury thermometers were a household staple, used on babies, adults, even pets. Tucked in bathroom drawers or first aid kits, they were slim, silver, and dangerously beautiful. If you were sick, your mom would shake the thermometer to reset the mercury, then slide it under your tongue or arm. You waited in silence, watching the silvery liquid rise and hold its place. Nobody questioned it. It was science. It was routine. But those thermometers were filled with mercury, a potent neurotoxin that could poison the air if the glass broke, and they often did. A slip from the counter or a hard shake could send beads of mercury rolling across the floor like tiny balls of doom. Most families wiped them up with tissues or brooms, unaware of the harm. Today, mercury thermometers have been almost entirely phased out, replaced by digital ones that beep instead of shimmer. But for kids of the 80s, that little glass stick was part of every fever, every flu, every call to grandma for what to do next. And just like nobody questioned the mercury, nobody questioned mixing alcohol with open water, especially when summer meant floating down a river without a care in the world. In the 1970s, having a built-in wet bar was a sign that you had made it. It meant you were a host, a social connector, someone who knew how to entertain with style. The mirrored backsplash, the chrome railing, the smoked glass shelves lined with liquor bottles. This was sophistication, suburban edition. But the reality rarely lived up to the fantasy. These bars were often shoved into corners of the basement, barely used except during holidays or awkward neighborhood gatherings. They collected dust, the plumbing rarely worked right, and the built-in mini fridges started leaking after a few years. Not to mention, America's relationship with alcohol shifted drastically in the decades that followed. The cocktail party scene began to fade. Suddenly, having a fully stocked alcohol station in your house felt less glamorous and more like a relic from your uncle's disco phase. What was meant to impress became an eyesore, especially when surrounded by orange carpeting and faux leather stools. So many of these bars were either ripped out entirely or turned into storage for board games and wrapping paper. But at least they were not a physical hazard. The next luxury home upgrade? That one came with a built-in trip and a bruised shin. Tucked quietly beneath the sink, the under-sink water heater was one of those features you never thought about, until it saved you 5 minutes in the morning. These little tanks provided instant hot water to just one faucet. Perfect for hand washing, quick dishes, or shaving if your sink doubled as a grooming station. Unlike the giant water heater in the basement, this one was small, efficient, and practically invisible. In homes where the main water heater was far away, these under-sink units made life easier. No waiting for hot water to snake through the pipes. But over time, centralized systems improved. Builders started planning homes with better plumbing routes. Energy efficiency standards changed, and these tiny tanks were declared unnecessary. Today, most have been removed or sit unplugged, collecting dust in old houses. But their legacy lives on in those first few seconds of hot water we all take for granted. Once, someone thought of that. Once, someone made it easier. When did we stop building for the little moments? The hand crank egg beater was a rite of passage. Long before mixers plugged into walls, children stood on stools beside their mothers, gripping the cool metal handle and turning the crank with both hands. The beaters would spin in a blur, blending sugar, eggs, and flour into the thick beginnings of birthday cakes and pancake batter. It was not efficient, but it was intimate. You felt the recipe coming together. Your arms grew sore, but your heart grew full. The egg beater did not make noise. It did not break. It did not ask for anything but effort. Every kitchen had one, usually tucked in a drawer next to the wooden spoons and measuring cups. Its clinking metal gears were as familiar as the smell of vanilla extract. And somehow, everything tasted better when it had been beaten by hand. Then came stand mixers, food processors, and digital timers. The crank beater was cast aside as outdated, inconvenient, old. But in that loss, something human disappeared. Now it hangs on antique shop walls, a symbol of effort, patience, and care. It taught us that food was not just made, it was earned. Why did we stop believing that some things are better when you feel them in your bones? Letting kids ride standing up in the back seat was not just overlooked, it was often encouraged. The space between the two front seats was a coveted spot, a mini stage where children stood to give directions, tell stories, or just feel taller. It felt like driving without actually driving. Parents drove with one arm loosely draped over the passenger seat while a child stood between them, gripping the dashboard, peering out at the road like a co-pilot. In the back, kids slid across vinyl seats, bounced with each turn, or lay down and stared at the ceiling. There were no reminders to buckle up, because buckling up was not yet a rule. It was a nuisance. The seatbelt often stayed buried beneath the cushions or was jammed into the crack between the seats. Today, it is illegal for a child to ride without a proper car seat or restraint. Parents now face fines, or worse, for what was once everyday family travel. But back then, riding unrestrained was just another way to feel free. There was trust, or maybe just oblivion. Either way, it was the norm. And if today's laws would call that reckless, the next parenting habit would cause even more of an uproar. It took place in plain sight, often with a crowd watching. The kitchen was the heart of the 1970s home, and avocado green was its crown jewel. At least, that is what the designers claimed. Appliances from toasters to refrigerators were coated in this earthy green, a color meant to feel natural and calming. But instead of evoking gardens and freshness, it often made kitchens feel dim, claustrophobic, and permanently stuck in the past. Imagine walking into a kitchen where every appliance matches the color of an overripe avocado. At the time, it felt sleek, stylish. But once that color started to fade, or clash with updated counters and cabinets, it became painfully clear that avocado green was never going to age gracefully. What once felt trendy now felt like a permanent bad decision baked into your kitchen. As tastes shifted toward lighter, brighter spaces, avocado green quickly became a design cliché. By the time the 1980s rolled in with its love for chrome and white laminate, avocado green kitchens became the punchline to a joke about bad design choices. Today, they serve as a visual reminder that what is trendy now might become embarrassing later. But green was not the only color we overcommitted to. There was another hue that infiltrated every home and overstayed its welcome, especially underfoot. It is hard to explain to someone today why there would be an ironing board in the kitchen. But for generations of American homemakers, ironing while cooking made perfect sense. You could press shirts while pasta boiled. The ironing board lived behind a narrow cabinet door, usually next to the fridge or near a pantry wall. You would open the latch, fold it down, and start ironing right there on the linoleum. It made the kitchen feel like a command center. Meals, laundry, homework, all happening at once. Some were even wired with built-in sockets, so you could plug in your iron without running cords across the room. There was something deeply efficient and strangely comforting about handling both dinner and dress shirts in the same breath. It made the kitchen feel like the heart of everything, not just the place where food was made. It sounds absurd now, but back then it was the ultimate multitasker's dream. Eventually, fashion changed, and so did fabrics. Permanent press clothing came along, and ironing became less of a daily ritual. Builders stopped including these wall units, and the ones that remained often jammed or collected dust. Today, a recessed ironing board in the kitchen wall feels like something out of a time capsule. You can still see the outline on painted-over cabinet doors in old houses. But no one's waiting on the kettle while smoothing out their slacks anymore. What else have we quietly stopped doing? The chamber stove did something no modern appliance dares attempt. It kept cooking after you turned it off. That was not a gimmick. That was engineering genius wrapped in cast iron and chrome. Born in the early 20th century, the chamber stove became a quiet sensation in post-war homes for one incredible reason. It cooked with the gas turned off. Thanks to thick insulation and a sealed oven chamber, you could roast an entire chicken, switch off the flame halfway, and let retained heat do the rest. It was efficient, elegant, and oddly futuristic. And while it lacked a touchscreen or a clock, it came with something more valuable: trust. People swore by it. Some still do. The stove's signature thermowell let you slow-cook soups and stews deep inside a lidded metal pit while you handled the rest of your day. The burners had griddles built right in, and the oven door sealed tighter than a vault. It made people feel clever, like they were cooking smarter, not harder. But in the rush for newer, faster, shinier appliances, the Chambers was quietly pushed aside. Too heavy, too bulky, too slow. Or so we thought. Why did we stop believing that doing more with less was the smartest design of all? Drinking and floating on rivers without life jackets was summer at its most carefree and most dangerous. You grabbed a giant black inner tube, packed a cooler full of beer, and drifted with your friends down slow-moving waters for hours. No one wore a life jacket, most could barely swim, but it was never about safety. It was about the sun, the music, and the freedom to float with no responsibilities. Some tied their tubes together. Others threw a rope to a canoe hauling more drinks. The river became a party, and the risks were part of the fun. You might remember falling out and laughing, feet searching for the rocky bottom, arms flailing before someone pulled you back in. Today, alcohol use while floating or boating is strictly monitored. Life jackets are required for anyone under a certain age in most states, and adults can face citations, or worse, for ignoring safety laws. But in the 1980s, there was no lecture, no patrol, just a lazy current and a long afternoon. And while the river taught you how to stay afloat, the classroom taught something entirely different, often with a wooden paddle. The promise of modular furniture was simple: flexibility, creativity, and smart design for small spaces. What we got instead was a collection of flimsy particle board pieces that wobbled with every move. These were the stackable shelves, folding tables, and interchangeable couch systems that dominated catalogs in the 1970s. And on paper, they made sense. Custom configurations, easy to rearrange, and light enough to move around by yourself. But there was a reason they were light. They were also fragile. The locking mechanisms broke, the cheap finishes peeled, and what looked cool in the store rarely held up under the daily wear of real life. Coffee tables would sag in the middle. Bookshelves leaned like tired soldiers. Even the stylish-looking modular couches were uncomfortable and awkward to clean. Some homeowners embraced the idea at first, charmed by the sense of innovation. But over time, the frustration set in. The dream of flexible living turned into a house full of disposable furniture. And if the modular design failed to impress, the next status symbol at least came with its own built-in glamour, until nobody wanted it anymore. The cold spot refrigerator was not just an appliance. It was the promise of a modern American life, humming quietly behind a steel door. Born in 1928 and sold by Sears for nearly 50 years, it was as dependable as it was beautiful. But in 1935, the cold spot became something extraordinary. That year, legendary designer Raymond Loewy transformed it into a sleek, curved monument to the future. Gone were the clunky bolts and exposed hinges. In their place, smooth lines, minimal handles, and a shape that looked more like a Cadillac fender than a food locker. It was the first refrigerator to look good in the spotlight, not just behind the scenes. Inside, it had adjustable shelves, crisper drawers, and butter compartments, all luxuries at the time. It was quiet, reliable, and built to last for decades. Families placed cherished leftovers in its embrace. Birthday cakes, cold fried chicken, pitchers of lemonade. This was where comfort lived. And yet, the cold spot's legacy faded as mass manufacturing favored cheaper materials and disposable models. The beauty disappeared. The silence was replaced with buzz and blinking lights, and the promise of forever was swapped for one-year warranties. When did we decide that cold convenience was more important than warm design? Imagine opening your cabinet to plan dinner and seeing a chalkboard right on the inside of the door. Some even had pull-down recipe scrolls made of parchment or linen, mounted like an old-fashioned map. You could write a grocery list, the day's menu, or a reminder that your mother-in-law was coming over. These weren't just novelty features, they were part of how a kitchen thought out loud. In a time before smartphones or sticky notes, these were the planners, the notepads, the command centers of the kitchen, and they told a story. In chalk dust and grease smudges, you could see a family's week unfold. Sometimes the writing faded, but the memory of it never did. It was handwriting that knew your routines better than you did. Eventually, they faded out. Whiteboards came in, then apps, then voice memos. Cupboards no longer had messages waiting. Now, kitchens are silent and glossy, all smooth wood and cold steel. No one scribbles "meatloaf tonight" inside a drawer anymore. The charm is gone, and so is the handwriting. But in old kitchens, those chalk smears still whisper what once was. When did we stop writing things down where it mattered most? If these everyday sights from the 1970s made you smile, shake your head, or remember your own, share your favorite in the comments. Tap like to keep the memories alive, and subscribe so you never miss our next trip back in time.